Good morning, everyone. Jim Laird here live in Largo, Florida. Let me tell you what, the fall and the spring here in Florida is insane. As somebody that grew up in Northern Canada, I really appreciate the fall and the spring here. But beautiful morning this morning. I've got Christian Thibaudeau with me this morning. Great strength coach who I've been following for a very long time. You know, Christian, one of the things I appreciate about you, I've followed you since you're on T Nation from the beginning. I think Paula Quinn is the one that made me aware of you originally. And, you know, obviously you're a fellow Canadian.
Yeah.
But one of the things I appreciate about you is you always give the pros and cons of everything. I think, you know, in this space, unfortunately, people get in these camps, like whether it's, you know, it's West Side or dog crap training or Mike Mentzer, or, you know, they'll have success with whether it's a training modality or they'll have success whether it's a diet. You know, I've tried them all. I'm sure you have. Body Opus, Dan Duchesne, Dr. DePasquale stuff. I mean, we've all experimented with this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody, they'll have success with one modality for a certain period of time, and they think everyone has to do that. Right. And you've always done a really good job of explaining the pros and cons of everything, saying, hey, this might work for you, but it might not. And like you, I originally got into fasting because of Ori Hofmeckler and the Warrior Diet. And I was like, this is great. I can, you know, I'm already big and muscular, so I can stay lean and I can eat pizza and ice cream. And he actually encouraged that, you know? So, you know, we see this constantly in our practice. In my coaching career, it's the busy mom, you know, not sleeping well, taking care of everyone else. Her circadian rhythm is busted.
Mm-hmm.
She's training, she's trying to burn fat, and she goes on a low carb diet or a keto diet or carnivore, and then the wheels just come right off the wagon. You know, could you explain the mechanisms of why this is, like, for people that are highly stressed, people that are running around like a chicken with their head cut off, that low carb and keto or fasting might not be the best tool for them at the moment?
Right. Well, actually, the thing that will help people understand why they might not be suited for them is actually the mechanism that makes some people feel good on them.
Mm-hmm.
Namely, that it does increase both cortisol and adrenaline. That's something that happens when you are either deprived of food or if you're deprived of carbohydrates. It basically keeps your body in that hyperactive mode. It does favor the increase of cortisol. And the reason for that is you need to understand that the functions of cortisol, well, first, cortisol is not the enemy, right? It's needed for survival. It's actually needed to perform well in the gym. If you try to inhibit cortisol completely, then you cannot perform. I'm going to explain why. The problem becomes when cortisol becomes chronically elevated, okay? Normally, you would increase cortisol when you're facing a stressful situation. Let's say you are in a jungle and you have to fight a tiger or run away from that tiger, right? Or if you're in a gym and you need to lift a big ass barbell, otherwise the barbell kills you, right? Or any kind of situation requiring a lot of mental focus, awareness, as well as competitiveness. The reason is that cortisol, once it's released in that stressful situation, it will itself release the increase the release of adrenaline, especially at the cortical or brain level. What happens is that cortisol tells essentially the body to convert noradrenaline, which is a neurotransmitter that we have, and that's very important for focus and concentration. And it will convert it into adrenaline, which is the fight or flight neurotransmitter, right? And that actually makes you feel good because it gives you energy, it gives you drives, it gives you the sensation of energy. It's not energy, it's just that you are amping your brain up, right? So people who start, let's say, intermittent fasting or keto, they are often flabbergasted that at first they have tons of energy. Say, dude, this keto or intermittent fasting is awesome. It gives me energy. Well, the energy comes at a price, okay? Because if that cortisol constantly is being pumped out and adrenaline constantly is being high, it will have several drawbacks. The first one is that it will completely screw up your sleep. The reason for that is that you cannot go to sleep if your brain is amped up. or hyperactive. You go to bed, you twist and turning, you're creating scenario stories in your head. You're thinking about this, thinking about that. The main reason why people can't sleep is that when they go to bed, instead of being in that rest and recover mode, they are still in that do shit mode, right? Because of adrenaline. That's the activation hormone, neurotransmitter. You need to increase more melatonin, and melatonin and cortisol are opposite hormones. You cannot have high melatonin if cortisol is high. And melatonin needs to be released when you initiate your sleep or resting routine at home. It should start to elevate at like 5 or 6 p.m. to gradually help you relax and go to bed, right? People who rely on melatonin pills, they take that right before sleeping. That won't do shit, because it's not a sleeping pill. It just tells your body, now we are in the rest and recover mode part of the day, right? But if cortisol and adrenaline stay high at 6, 7 p.m., you cannot shut down your brain. So you go to bed and your brain still think it's being active. And the fact is that low carbs and food deprivation can potentiate that, because the second function of cortisol is to make sure that when you are in that stressful situation, you don't run out of resources to fight that situation. Let's say you're fighting a tiger, right? The last thing you want is run out of energy so you can't fight anymore or can't run away anymore. So cortisol, on top of increasing adrenaline to amp you up, increasing the sensation of strength, of power, of well-being, of competitiveness, it will also increase the mobilization of stored energy. People think that cortisol is a fat gain hormone. In fact, it's a fat loss hormone. The main function of cortisol is to mobilize stored energy. And when bodybuilders are afraid of cortisol because they think that it's going to eat away your muscle, that's actually part of that function. It will break down any stored energy to make it available so that you don't die while fighting a tiger, right? The problem is that when cortisol is high, the body doesn't know if it's from a tiger or from not paying your taxes, okay, or having marital problems or conjugate problems or financial issues. You just know that there's a risk and you need to mobilize everything. So cortisol will increase glucose mobilization, so it will break down muscle glycogen to make it into glucose. That can actually lead to high blood sugar, which can lead to insulin resistance. That's another side effect of elevated cortisol. And I'm going to get back to that when we talk about intermittent fasting in a moment. But because oddly enough, and okay, I'm often go on tangent, so sorry about that. I'm going to try to bring it home afterward.
Love it. Love it.
A lot of people who do keto dieting, and I've known that for a long time, but I didn't know it, meaning I've observed it among bodybuilders that I've used keto dieting with or low carbs dieting with, but didn't know what was happening until I've read some studies about that, is that if you are on a keto or low carbs diet for a while, you actually become insulin resistant. At first, when you start from I'm going to eat crap diet to low carbs dieting, your insulin sensitivity will improve at first, okay? But if you stay on that for a longish term, you become resistant, especially at the muscle level. Your muscles become resistant to insulin. And I've seen that in bodybuilders who spend the whole contest prep dieting on low carbs. Then they try to fill out for their competition by eating a boatload of carbs, and they just can't fill out. They just can't, okay? And it's a protective mechanism, because if the body wants its blood glucose to be stable, and obviously if you don't eat carbs, it's kind of hard to maintain that blood glucose level elevated. The only way to do it is to pump out cortisol to mobilize stored blood sugar, glycogen in the muscle. So that's why cortisol is chronically elevated when you are doing a keto diet, because you need to keep that blood sugar stable. So you constantly need to mobilize stored muscle glycogen, and the hormone that does that is principally or mostly cortisol. Glucagon also plays a role, and growth hormone a bit. Now, getting back to the insulin resistant thing, because it becomes harder to keep a stable blood sugar level on a keto diet, the body will actually make the muscles resistant to insulin. Why? Because it doesn't want to send the blood glucose to the muscles. That's what insulin does. Insulin is a hormone that tells the body to clear out the nutrients from the bloodstream. People think that the purpose of insulin is to drive nutrients into the muscle. That's a side effect. The role of insulin is to avoid high blood sugar level. But if you're taking out the glucose from the bloodstream, it must go somewhere. And the nutrients must go somewhere. The fatty acids must go somewhere. So they either are stored in the muscle or in the fat cells or in the liver, mostly. So if you make the muscles insulin resistant, then you are less likely to clear out that blood glucose and send it to the muscle. So it's easier to maintain a stable blood sugar level. And that's something that I've seen if you go on keto dieting for more than 6 to 8 weeks. Okay. Yep. It becomes really, really hard. And obviously that will negatively impact your training, your recovery, your anabolism. So that's my tangent. But to get back to the topic, cortisol's main function when it comes to energy, it will break down muscle glycogen, will break down fatty acids and protein to be used for fuel. So if you are constantly in a state of low carbohydrates, so you're keto dieting or you're intermittent fasting, so you have no nutrients coming in, it means that the blood sugar level will be lower than usual, which can be a good thing if it's too high. It's better too low than too high. But if you're bordering hypoglycemia, that's not healthier. So the body, because it wants to maintain balance, when it senses that blood glucose is low, it will force the release of cortisol to bring up blood glucose level. So you're basically spending the whole day in a high cortisol state. Now, remember that a hormone cannot be dissociated from one of its functions. So you cannot say, I'm going to take the glucose mobilization function of cortisol, but I'm not going to take the adrenaline boosting function. That doesn't work like that. If cortisol is released, it will do everything it does. And that means increasing adrenaline. So adrenaline will be released, and that makes it a lot harder to sleep during the night. That would be the main issue. The secondary issue, and that's the reason why you will have a lot of people, and that's I would say, the worst situation. You go on a keto dieting, you go on intermittent fasting, and you feel great for 4 weeks. The first, that's like a godsend. My anxiety is gone. I'm alpha male. I'm confident. I'm driven. I can do shit during the day. The problem is that after like 5 weeks, it becomes the complete opposite. You crash badly. Now, the problem is during those 4 weeks, you feel so good that you basically make yourself part of the cult. You become convinced that it's great because it does. So when you start to feel like crap, you assume that it's something else. Maybe something is wrong with your training, with your whatever, but you never blame the nutrition because the first 4 weeks were so great. But what is happening is that
that happens in the vegan community too, absolutely. Right? And the wheels come off the wagon and they're like, oh, it can't be the fact that I'm only eating vegetables.
Yeah, but the vegan, it would be for slightly different reasons, but it's happening any restrictive diet. Right. First, I'm going to get back to that, but from a vegan perspective, it's also cortisol, but mostly because if you are vegan, it's extremely hard to not be in a caloric deficit. Yes. That's why these guys are like all gaunt in the face and all skinny for the most part.
Well, that's why cows and gorillas, they eat all day. Yeah. In order to get the amino acids they need, they have to eat constantly. That's all they do is eat. And personally, I don't want to spend, 20 hours of my day eating, the amount of broccoli I would need to get the same nutrients I can get from 6 ounces of steak. It's just like...
It's crazy. And from a taste perspective, that's also another issue. But the fact is that, if you want to do veganism the right way, as you mentioned, you need to basically spend your whole life eating. Okay. But most people don't do that, obviously. So they are left in a situation where they are constantly in a caloric deficit. Now, even if you have carbs coming in from fruits and whatever, if you're in a deficit, it's the same thing. If you're in a deficit, you still need to constantly mobilize stored energy to function because you're not giving your body enough energy, right? So what is increased when you need to mobilize energy? Cortisol. So you once again have an increase in cortisol, which increases adrenaline, which makes you eventually resistant to adrenaline and also having sleep issues. Plus, on the vegan side, they will be deficient in vitamin B12, which will affect the whole methylation cycle, which will actually magnify the cortisol's response. And that's the main reason, the methylation cycle, the lack of B12 behind the higher rate of depression among vegan. Although, I mean, if I had to eat broccoli every single day, every meal, I would probably be depressed too. But anyway,
I agree.
Yeah. So getting back to that, so the fact that you are constantly pumping out adrenaline because of the cortisol means that your adrenergic receptors, the receptors in your body, which is fine in your brain, in your muscles, in your heart, in many tissues, they all have receptors that interact with adrenaline, right? But these are the receptors that become resistant the easiest. And it's fairly easy to understand because let's take another receptor. Let's take estrogen or even, let's say, testosterone or androgen receptors. Let's say that you find a bottle of testosterone suspension, okay, and you inject 5 grams of testosterone in one shot, which is probably not a super smart thing to do, but you will not die. Worst case scenario, you're going to have the hardest boner in the history of mankind and some elevated blood pressure for a day or two.
Yeah, you're going to be very angry too.
Yeah. But there's no risk for your safety or health. Whereas if you overload the adrenaline receptors, then your heart rate can go up because there are receptors on the brain. So the more you amp yourself up, you can reach dangerously high level of heart rate and blood pressure, which can actually lead to something called dying, which is a bit worse than a hard boner as far as side effects are concerned, right?
Right.
So to protect yourself against that happening, those receptors are extremely easy to desensitize or downregulate. The slightest increase in, let's say, if someone, and I'm sadly talking from experience because I had my rave experiences. Anytime I would take something that would affect the adrenergic systems, like amphetamines, for example, or ephedrine or something like that, obviously I feel like an alpha version of myself. But the next day, I'm super depressed, and I essentially have no sexual function. And that's because I'm actually becoming resistant to my own adrenaline in as little as one day. That's a protective mechanism. So because it becomes desensitized so easily, if you constantly bombard those beta-adrenergic receptors with the adrenaline because of the high cortisol that's high all day, what happens is you make your receptors less and less and less responsive to your own adrenaline. So at first, you feel amazing because you're constantly in that high adrenaline, amped up state, like I'm at right now, which is the best version of myself. But I'm going to pay a price later because if you desensitize those receptors, you can no longer get amped up. So you are constantly in the opposite state. Basically lazy, unmotivated, depressed, low self-esteem, low self-confidence. So a lot of people will now result on, I'm going to drink tons of caffeine to get the work done.
Modafinil, Adderall, we've struggled with both of us struggle with stimulants,
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm glad you brought up chronic stress because I compare modern life to going outside, getting in your car in the driveway, putting it in park and revving the shit out of it all day, and never driving anywhere. Right. And so you get these people there, cortisol is amazing too. When you're in that stress state, everything feels great. You feel no pain. Everything's great until you hit that resistance point, like you said, and the wheels come off the bus. That's why when I work with people, especially women in particular are more sensitive to this. Men tend to be a little more resilient from an endocrine system standpoint, is getting their respiratory rate down, getting that chronic stress, teaching them to shut off, because they can't relax and they can't sleep. They don't go outside. Most of these people are highly driven. So first thing that comes into their mind is I have to do more. Obviously I'm not training hard enough or I'm not doing enough. We have to get the system to shut off so we can allow the system to recover and relax and get themselves back on the right path, and unfortunately a lot of the people that we deal with are highly driven, highly successful, and it's very hard for them to the key is to go for a 10-minute walk 3 times a day, get outside, get your sleep in order, do some breathing drills before bed to help you relax. Most of the people that we deal with, and even with ourselves, it took me destroying my health several occasions. I believe you're in the same boat before I finally had to realize, after I do a podcast, I have to go sit quietly and breathe through my nose and relax and chill. Especially strength coaches fall into this. Like, you've got 4 to 6 group sessions a day and it's 2:00 in the afternoon. And I've got to be animated, especially working with big teams. Like, when I was working at University of Arizona, you couldn't, you're working with 80 football players. You can't just stand there and be like, do. So you reach for the spike, you reach for the ephedra, and then on top of that, you throw in, ultra low carb. You're just wrecking yourself. I've found that, particularly with women, a lot of my business people, they want the best of both worlds, right? So there was a guy named Kiefer who did carb night, carb backloading. I've found for those people that want to do the best of, they kind of want the best of both. They want that focus during the day, the low carb, deal. And then they add some carbohydrates at night. It helps them sleep. It helps them relax. It helps them recover from training. I've found that works fairly well for me. When I do fast, I make sure on those fasting days, I'm walking, I'm meditating. I'm trying not to basically go crazy. And then on the days I train, I actually overeat. I want that benefit of holding more water, so protect my joints so I can train more explosively. I want to use that glycolytic pathway. A lot of people don't understand the consequences, and a lot of people will fast and they'll still train like a maniac. It's a great tool, but you got to adjust your training according to what you're doing.
So many different things I want to comment on, because it's lots of great stuff you mentioned. The first thing, the simplest one, it's an explanation why women are more at risk than men from the high cortisol issue. 2 things. First, they have a higher glutamate level, and glutamate makes you more sensitive to cortisol's action. Glutamate is essentially an emotional amplifier. Its real function is it improves memory. But the way it does that is by amplifying the emotional state you're in. Because the way the brain works is we have a selective memory. We cannot store everything in our brain, right? So the first pass to see what is important or not is the emotional state you are in when it happens. The more emotional you are when something happens, the more your brain thinks it's important. So glutamate, by amplifying emotion, both good and bad, which is why women also have higher roller coaster emotion because of high glutamate. Estrogen increases glutamate, and glutamate increases sensitivity to cortisol. Second reason is the ratio of DHEA to cortisol has been shown to be the main factor involved in resiliency. So people who are naturally resilient will have a higher DHEA to cortisol ratio. And obviously men tend to have a higher DHEA level than women. That's why DHEA supplementation, especially in form of cream, work really, really, really well with women, but doesn't do much for men because it's not the limiting factor. Anyway, also, when you mention, the fasting, it's funny because subconsciously I came with the same conclusion as you did, that the day I'm fasting, because I'm using fasting as a tool. For example, when I'm presenting on a seminar, I'm fasted during the day because I'm willing to pay a small price at the end of the day for being more in the moment, being more productive in the moment. And so it's something I will often use as a tool. And it's also a good way to establish a caloric deficit without having to have a large deficit on any single day. So one thing I did was a plan I use myself oftentimes. I call it Primer 52, which essentially has 2 intermittent fasting days or fasting days in the week. But these are always on either mobility or just walking days. It's never training days, And oftentimes I would put the day afterwards, because it's my highest carb day, would be more of a hypertrophy session, and the strength day would be the second day afterwards, because now your glycogen stores are full, you're reading water, so you're stronger. But yeah, I absolutely agree with that. People are the problem is that losing fat or improving your body composition is an emotional thing. You look at yourself in the mirror and you want that to be changed right now. So they are willing to throw all the tools at the same time. It's like medication. I mean, medication have interactions with each other. Same thing with training and nutrition. I mean, intermittent fasting is a good tool if it's done with everything that should go with intermittent fasting, which is parasympathetic work, relaxing work, because it's just too easy to get overly amped up. Like yesterday, I had a fast day, but I spent the whole day at the beach with my wife and kids. So that's the kind of, and I walked all day because it's freaking hot there and just want to go from pool or beach and so on and so forth. I had to go to the car, but we had like something like 20,000 steps during the day. When I'm on vacation, I often fast during those days so I can enjoy the buffet and the good food at the end. But
Absolutely.
I'm just relaxing during the day. Fasting and high stress level is the worst mix in the history of mankind. It will destroy both your neurology, your psychology, and as well as your physique. So it's a tool that can be used in the right mental and physical state, meaning that when you can relax. So in fact, like teaching, I always say that one of the best skill you can teach a client as a coach is the capacity to train hard. I mean, especially the newer generation, people just don't train hard anymore. They want to train a lot. They can train a boatload. They will do 30 sets for biceps. Okay, they can do that. They can do volume, but none of these sets are actually hard.
Right.
But and it might somewhat work because of the sheer amount of loading on the tissue, but there's also a problem that comes with it. It's certainly not efficient, but they just don't have that skill to work hard anymore. So the things you need to teach a client for training is to train hard and using good form. When it comes to life, I think that the capacity to go from here to here, so to relax yourself, is the best skill you can teach to a client, because life will throw shit at you. And if, let's say, having an incident in traffic in the morning ruins the whole day because you're mad and pissed the whole day, that then stress is winning. You're not.
Well, it comes down to variability, right? Is high blood pressure bad? Yeah. Not necessarily if I'm chasing you with a machete, right?
Yeah.
Is low blood pressure bad? If it's great if you're trying to go to sleep. If I'm chasing you with a machete, it's not so good. The ability to switch back and forth, right? So you get these people that have no metabolic flexibility, and then they throw fasting in there.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's just not a good strategy. Like,
no, it's not.
You know, the foundational habits of like walking outside, you know, eating a protein at every meal, you know, getting the lights off at night, you know, drinking high quality water, having good social connection. That's the foundation that your training should be built on.
Right.
And then you can throw these little modalities in from time to time. And guess what? They're not going to work forever. You're going to have to change modalities from time to time. But most people are just jumping between these fancy modalities and they don't have any kind of foundation. Mm-hmm. And the thing I see, especially with the younger generation, you know, you and I think we're roughly the same age. I mean, our childhoods, we spent hours playing outside, you know, hockey, you know, we had good physical education in Canada. I don't know what it's like now, but we had gymnastics in school. We had dance. We had, you know, we learned how to play squash and badminton, and we did everything, you know. So when I went, and I also did manual labor. So when I went to football practice or wrestling practice, it was a joke, right? We could handle hard training. Most of these people today, these kids, they don't have the foundation where their body can actually handle hard training. So really, honestly, in the next, you know, 5 to 10 years as strength and conditioning coaches, we're going to become basically physical education teachers, giving these people what they should have had from the beginning so we can actually do some cool training, right? You know, because most of these people I see today, you know, you put them on a real basic, you know, you put them on like push the prowler, do some carries, do some bear crawls for 6 to 8 weeks. And wow, they've made massive improvement because they didn't have any foundation at all.
Jim Wendler was mentioning that at first when he was working with his high school football team, all they did was like body weight squats, push-ups, and they all made massive improvement. But it's what I define the younger athlete as highly specialized motor neurons. Like they are, if you have a hockey player, it will be extraordinarily skilled at hockey because he essentially does that year round. But it has no other motor skills, motor skills. And the problem is that is extremely limiting and will lead to injuries. And many studies are showing that single sport athletes are at higher risk of injuries. But even worse than that is that at least those are doing some sport. But the fact is that even back in our day, everybody was active. I mean, the biggest nerd in the class was still doing several sports because of physical education, which we had like 3 times a week, something like that. Now it's like once a week, if that. It's funny because my father was actually, when he was a college professor, he was involved in a study. They did an experimentation when they doubled the amount of physical education classes while reducing some, of course, math and French classes because, you can't stay in school forever at that time. And what they found first, after the whole year, those who had double the physical education had better grades, even in math and English and French, than those who didn't have the added physical education, but had more math classes. And second is that they did a follow-up study 20 years later. And the people involved in the test group, which was the twice as much physical education, were a lot more active and involved in much more physical activity than the other group. So the amount of physical activity you do in your youth directly impact the lifestyle you're going to have for the rest of your life.
Well, and brain development. I mean, that's how your brain develops. I mean, children play on the floor. That's how they develop their brain, right?
Yeah.
So, the more, even when you get older too, movement has a big part in like keeping your brain healthy. And we've just taken that out of our lives. I mean, 30, 40 years ago, you would have been active as part of your life. And now you can just sit on your couch and have the food delivered to your door. You don't have to do anything for it. And we're going to pay, we're paying already, and we're going to pay a steep price for that. And, your point about specificity, athleticism is what you need to develop in young athletes. I mean, you look at the greatest of all time, Gretzky could have played baseball or hockey or lacrosse. Peyton Manning was a good baseball player. Tom Brady was a great baseball player. Patrick Mahomes could have gone, played in baseball. You guys like Deion Sanders. Athleticism, you can always get better at being skilled later. But once you get out of that younger window, athleticism becomes much more difficult to develop. And we're focused on developing these skills instead of building the bottom of the pyramid. And the reason the United States can get away with it is because we have such a huge
numbers.
Huge numbers. That's why the Soviet Union had to develop their conjugate system, because they lost their entire alpha male population, essentially in the Battle of Stalingrad.
Yeah.
So they had to come up with this system of finding what works best, building a foundation, putting kids in the sport that their body type and their mentality is driven towards, right? I remember listening to Charlie Francis talk about this constantly. He's like, I'm looking for certain traits as a sprinter, and they'll force, you'll have these kids, they'll force these kids into sports that, one, their body structure isn't made for, and two, they don't have a mentality for, but because that's the sport they got put in when they were 6 years old, well, that's the sport we're going to play. Yeah. It's totally upside down and backwards.
Yeah. Anyways, it's the worst thing is it's actually starting even younger. And I actually did a presentation at CanFit Pro of all places, like the leftist leaning part of training in Canada. And my presentation was on child development, how to take someone from childbirth to athlete. And it was called Your Kid Sucks and It's Your Fault. And the main point I was driving is that modern parents are essentially not parents at all. The TV is the parents. It's a surrogate.
The screen. Mm-hmm.
So, and the problem with that is, first, you never spend time actually learning motor skills. That's the first thing. But even worse is that it reprograms the brain, because modern televisions, which, we watched television when we were younger, but it was not the same type of light being used to produce the image on the screen. Now the modern screen, including the laptop, the cell phone, TVs, laptop, all emit blue light, which is a very, very strong dopamine stimulant. It essentially has, on your brain level, the same effect as sex or chocolate. So it becomes very addictive. The biggest problem is that, and we even see that in adult, but at least in adult, if your brain is formed and you overdo the blue light thing by spending too much time in front of screen, if you do like a 1 to 2 week blue light fast, so you stop watching screens, you will resolve the situation. But with kids, because the brain is not fully formed yet, you can actually make your brain permanently desensitized to your own dopamine.
Yep.
Because now you're bombarding the developing brain with an amount of dopamine stimulating blue light that it cannot normally handle, and it readjusts itself. So now your own dopamine production that comes when you are achieving a goal, for example, because that's the purpose of dopamine, is it rewards you when you accomplish something useful, so that you will be looking to do that again in the future. It's a survival neurotransmitter. But now, if you accomplish a goal, if you win at something, you improve yourself, the pleasure response that should come from that is not even strong enough to create that pleasure response.
Yeah.
So that's why we have a younger generation who has no resiliency, The moment something gets hard, they stop trying. Look at like the relationship issue. I mean, if you the young generation, if they are in a relationship for longer than 3 months, that's an exploit. The moment they get into the job market, they are asked to work 40 hours a week. They'll change jobs.
Yep.
So it's the moment it gets hard, because the reason, it's not because they're lazy. It's not their fault. It's their parents' fault, because the over reliance on television and screen from a very young age completely made them resistant to their own mechanism that promotes resiliency and drive and competitiveness.
Well, there's a reason why guys like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs never let their kids play with phones. They sent them to Waldorf school, right? To, and not only the blue light affecting, artificial light affecting dopamine, but it also affects blood sugar. I've done experiments where I've eaten a stack of pancakes outside, in the sun, and taken my blood sugar. And then I've eaten that same stack of pancakes indoors, and my blood sugar was almost twice as high under like fluorescent lights as it was eating it out in the sun. So as humans have moved more of having an indoor more lifestyle, and you got nitric oxide from sunshine, blood pressure, ED, erectile dysfunction. As cultures around the world have moved inside, the diabetes, the high blood pressure, all these things have gone up. And the worst thing about the screens, there's nothing worse than getting dopamine for free. Right. That's why things like cocaine are so dangerous. Like I saw that and I was just like, I can't do that because I'll be doing it all the time. Dopamine needs to come with hard work. And then you have
the reward system.
And then you have combine that with chronic low testosterone. You just have no drive to do anything at all. You basically just sit in front of a screen all day and drink energy drinks. And that's essentially what we've got.
And that's so important. People need to do it's a reward system. And why would you work hard for something you can get from a fast food meal, a pizza, a chocolate? Right. So now you have, on top of that, you have obesity because you have physical inactivity.
Right.
So you're becoming literally larvas.
Right. Well, I have a feeling, how long do you think it's going to be before we both get burned at the stake for like saying there's differences between men and women? And I think it's coming quickly. I hope we have.
You'll get problems way before than I do, because I'm perceived as a good guy.
Right. Because you have an accent.
Probably. I mean, French guys are always nicer. That's a fact.
You have the way to. The French can kind of romanticize themselves out of situations, right?
We're very good talkers.
They're a good charmer. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm not a good charmer. Otherwise, I would be more successful with women. But I mean, under certain circumstances, I'm pretty good at getting myself out of jam. But it also goes back to what you were saying earlier, when I always present the pros and cons, which actually probably like really hurt me financially.
Sure.
Because what makes money is polarizing opinion. That's what
that is correct.
The internet is at. And I just can't be that person. So my own personal beliefs is obvious. And I don't know one strength coach will not say that women and men are biologically different. They each have their own skill sets. It's literally two different species. I mean, just from an evolutionary standpoint, like for example, from a vision standpoint, like color blindness tend to be more rampant in men, because when we were growing up, like during caveman days and stuff
evolving.
Evolving. Then women were in charge of making sure that nobody got poisoned and died. So they needed to be much better able to recognize threat from the food they were eating, from stuff like that. Whereas men were more big picture guys out with hunting, and having too many distractions can actually make them less efficient at hunting. Yep. So that's one evolutionary adaptation. But I mean, anybody with worth his salt that understand how physiology works knows that there's two sexes.
Well, and it's interesting. Women also have to be more sensitive to the environment, so they can pass those adaptations of what's needed to survive in the environment to the next generation.
100%.
Right? And people don't understand what our modern world is basically creating. It's creating this monster of, empty calories. The body's basically, these women are eating these, highly processed foods with low micronutrients. and the body is saying, well, we're starving to death, but we have to. So obviously we need to create an organism that's really good at handling stress. So it basically creates this organism that basically lower metabolic rate, high ability to handle stress, because it thinks it's starving because it's getting too many calories, but it's not getting any nutrition.
Yeah.
And so we end up with these,
but undernourished.
yeah. And so it's the complete opposite of what we've been wired to do forever and ever and ever. And it's just insane. And I'm not saying we all need to go back to like, living around a campfire, but we've got to understand what our biology needs to thrive. Right. And getting outside more and being more active, and then moving every day. These are all super, super important things. We talk about Jim. I slept on Jim's floor for a year in like 2000, right before he started writing 531. And, there was a time I would always call Jim when I would kind of, in the mid 2000s, I was like, what do I do next? Like, what certification do I take next? And I got on a call with Jim, and he said to me, look, Laird, like, really, honestly, like, I think he had talked to Martin Rooney, and Martin had told him that he used like maybe 10% of his total knowledge on a daily basis working with clients, even guys in the NFL.
Yeah.
And Jim was like, dude, just be the best beginner coach possible. Like, most of the people you're working with, housewives, moms. And I actually like training women more than I like training men, because
100%.
a lot of times with men, it's about ego.
Yeah.
Unless it's young guys like 14, 15, then it's more about mentorship. Women respond so much better to mentorship than they do intimidation.
100%.
If you can teach them and mentor them, and that's more my style. I mean, I can be that gorilla if I need to be, but I don't like doing that. It takes too much energy. I would much rather teach, mentor, be supportive. That's more my coaching style. So 95% of my clients over the last 25 years have been women, and everyone else was fighting over the football players. And I'm like, I'm going to take this lady who's a housewife who can come in 3 to 4 days a week. I'm not competing with other coaches for her. Nobody wants to train her. And I'm going to get her to lift weights, and I'm going to get her better results. And then guess what? I can choose the athletes I want to train, instead of a lot of my buddies who, took a loan out to get a gym, and they're so desperate for clients, they had to take every athlete that came to them, regardless of whether they were compliant or not. So it's, let me ask you this to finish up. Like, if you have somebody that's buried themselves, you have a woman, she's done carnivore, keto, she's in a bad place, she's not sleeping. Like, how do you dig somebody out of that hole?
Well, I think that the first, that's somewhat of a long answer, or long solution.
Yeah.
Because it's essentially reprogramming a lifestyle. Right. Probably doing more low stress physical activity. That would be the first thing I would do. I mean, and the example I always come back to is they did a study on the Amish people. Mm-hmm. And what they found was, despite the fact that they were eating what should have been a huge caloric surplus, because they were eating, the average caloric intake for men was close to 4,000 calories. For women, it was close to 3,000 calories, or even a bit more than that. And it was large amount of butter, large amount of lard, and even decent amount of sugar, because they would actually eat a sugar. But they were so physically active. Right. They were taking an average of more than 20,000 steps per day. And that's on top of the hard physical labor they were doing. So, and they took the body fat percentages, and the men were all under 10%. The women were all under 18%, which is actually fairly low for women. And they were not training, but they essentially almost looked like athletes, because they were working physically. People should not forget that training is essentially artificial physical work.
Yeah, that's correct.
So I think that, and again,
I've joked about this for years, not to cut you off. I've joked about opening a farm and charging people to work on it.
It would actually probably attract tons of like high-end Hollywood types.
Yes. Because that's essentially what we've done. We've replaced, we have more gyms now than ever.
Yeah.
Right. And we've got more obese people than ever. We've replaced low-level manual activity. And I talk about this all the time, and people look at me like I'm nuts.
No.
We've replaced mowing the grass and building your shed in the backyard with going to the gym. And it just doesn't, that low level daily activity, especially the Amish, they're outside all the time. They don't have fake light.
Yeah.
So their circadian rhythms are all in order, all that good stuff.
That's the other
you
thing.
You cannot replace low-level daily manual activity with intensity. It just doesn't work.
It's not the same type. The problem is that the high intensity work, which I believe is needed for like peak function.
Correct.
But it's a dose relationship. You cannot just like, I'm going to compensate lack of low end stuff with more high end stuff. So when I'm, for example, if someone is, and I'm going to use more like bodybuilder-ish as an example, but not bodybuilders, like just someone who wants that type of physique, right? But not using anabolics and stuff like that, just get leaner and more muscular. And let's say that they are in a phase where they want to get leaner. Okay. The first thing I do is decrease the amount of lifting they're doing, because your body will not have the resources to handle as much physical loading. But we are compensating by increasing physical stress elsewhere, like low-end physical activity. Yeah. And I know that all coaches talk about that nowadays, because like the number of steps you're taking is now the big trend thing to do, trendy thing to do. But honestly, it's actually more than that. It's not just the amount of steps you're taking; it's the physical activity you're doing while being active. I can walk in my living room and get 10,000 steps. It will never have the same impact as working outside, doing yard work, walking with the dogs, walking the kids. And I'll also you brought up the circadian rhythm thing. I believe that most sleep issues are due to the fact that people are too late seeing the daylight every day.
I agree.
I believe that it's called Zeitgebergs. It's external signs that initiate internal processes. So when you first see the light of day, it initiates your body clock. And let's say that we have roughly 16 hours of awake time, or it takes 16 hours before we get into that rest and relax mode. Well, if you start that at 6 a.m., then at 9-ish, then you are ready to go to bed. You are in that relaxed mode. But if the first time you see daylight is 1 p.m. when you're on your lunch break, for example, then that's when your clock starts. So when you get home and it's midnight, you're still not in rest and recover mode, because your circadian rhythm, your clock is not there yet. So you'll fall asleep at 2 or 3 a.m.
Yep.
So that a simple routine, and that's something that I've been working on more when I work with a guy named Alex Kickel. Mm-hmm. He was adamant on every single day, as early as I can, I watch the light. And when you go to bed, you watch the moon. Yep. So that actually tells you it's external signs that initiate internal processes. Now, obviously, if you are, well, you're lucky you're not here anymore, but in Canada, sometimes it might not be possible to see the light of day in the morning, but then you can use red light therapy.
Well, and that's the thing. Traditional cultures, they'd have sweat lodges, they'd have saunas. The northern, of course, that's why I like the Inuit eat more, fatty things in the winter. And they sleep more. They hibernate essentially in the wintertime. So
and during the summer, as you mentioned, and you actually mentioned that earlier, and I was having this conversation with a friend of mine, and he mentioned that in the summer month, our insulin sensitivity is much higher. That's so ironically, most people, when do they diet down? They diet down in the summer because they want to they look good for the beach. In reality, that's when you should actually be eating more.
That is correct. And in the fall, so originally the way it works is as the UV light goes away, and there's things like squash and things like that are still available.
Yeah,
your body stores that as fat to prepare you for the winter. Right. And guess why everybody goes on these like the New Year's Revolution? That would be when you would be starting to get at your leanest from a traditional culture standpoint. You're trying to store as much energy and as much fat as you can over the wintertime. And then over the summer, and you get into the fall, you store tons of body fat to survive the winter. January, February, you're going to be at your leanest because you're getting into those extra resources. Right. And the cold helps kind of optimize your hormones and make you more sensitive. And then the whole process starts up over again. It's kind of like the bear. Yeah. The bear gets diabetic over the summer and then heals its diabetes through basically fasting over the hibernating, right? Yeah. So we've created this artificial world where you can eat a pineapple in Quebec City in the middle of January. Right. And it really doesn't match up with it, and we've created this world where it's essentially summer, 24/7 all year round. Yeah. And it's really doesn't match with our biology very much. And most people, it goes way over their head,
I mean, again, I don't want to go all Liver King and say that you need to go back to ancestral roots.
I agree.
But certainly you do need to, I mean, just, I don't want to say be a man. That doesn't sound good. But just do more stuff.
What we tell people, we start people off like 3 10-minute walks, the stand efforting thing, take some breaks, go to the park, get in nature. I always say to people, like what I'm doing right now, I do the majority of my work on my pool deck, right? Before I was in my gym from 5 a.m. till 8 p.m, and it just about killed me. Use technology, but don't let the technology use you. So you want to have I still mow my own grass. I'm still, I still go for walks constantly during the day.
Right.
So there's a way to have the best of both. The problem is it's human nature to chase the most convenient, like Wall-E, the character Wall-E, where you're just sitting in a chair with a tube and you got your virtual reality glasses on, and that's where we're going. And we're going to have to make conscious parents, especially. There's going to be a huge difference between kids that play outside and basically learn without screens and kids that learn with screens and are in a classroom all day. It's going to be like 2 different species of human. So the question is what are you going to choose for you and your family? And that's the battle that we have, is how do you live in this modern world without it totally destroying your biology?
Correct. And again, I think that it's a lot about balance. Like with my kids, they were not allowed to watch any screen before they were 3. And even now, it's like never more than 5 minutes. So I go with like your age in minutes. So let's say my youngest is 2 minutes, so the longest she can have is 2 minutes. My son is 5, but it always needs to come with physical activity first.
Correct.
So it's, for example, we'll go train. He's 5 now, but he was 4. He was doing power cleans and front squats and stuff like that.
I've seen that. Very good. Impressive.
And then we started boxing now. He actually asked me to buy some boxing gloves and heavy bags.
That's awesome.
We started boxing here. It's funny because yesterday we were, and that challenged me because we were at the beach. It was like literally like 36 degrees and we were boxing outside.
Yeah.
But I mean, one thing I really like about, like, when you mentioned the walk, I really like Stan's recommendation of, like, every time you eat, go for 10-minute walks. I mean, if you just do that, it does so much good. First, from a digestive standpoint, but also for the fact that it actually makes you think, do I really want that food? Do I need that food, or is it because I'm bored?
Right.
A lot of people eat out of boredom or because they just want some feeling. But if you know that you will have to do something physical afterwards, then you can ask yourself, I mean, do I really want that? Do I really need that? Right. Or is it just something because I want to eat because I'm bored? That's
it helps avoid that big blood sugar swing. And you and I both know, if you've got your blood sugar swinging all over the place, it's going to be hard for you not to become a human vacuum cleaner. So all these basic fundamental habits, they just basically check off so many boxes. It's just people always want to look for HRT or peptides, or those things all have their place, right? They just, even with athletes, they want what's the new fancy drill? Well, can you dribble with both hands? Well, no. Well, you probably should work on that before you worry about crossing it over and doing a reverse jam dunk, right? The human nature just wants to go to fancy.
But that's why you look at the European basketball players are not kicking the U.S. ass.
Yeah.
Because they are about work, about basics. Same thing with hockey, right? You look at in Canada, in the U.S., the skill level compared to like European hockey players, it's really, really bad. Baseball, same thing with the Dominican Republic and the U.S. guys, because they value motor skill first.
Yeah.
Here, it's about competition first.
Well, even the Soviets, like if you look at the way the Soviets look at their weight training schedule, off season, we're doing gymnastics, we're doing ping pong, we're doing whatever. And they go, the Russians, the Eastern European bloc, they go to junior world championships and they lift the weights they want to lift and they don't care about the result.
Correct.
The Americans are like, they're winning the world juniors and they're like, yeah. And the Russians are just sitting back smiling and go, yeah, but we'll be ready for you at the Olympics. Yeah. Right. Yeah. These coaches that are winning the 8th grade, baseball state championship, none of those kids end up showing up, when it really matters because they're all burnt. We put such a huge emphasis on learning. I mean, on winning as opposed to learning and athletic development. Like, we got to win in the 8th grade. Like, why? These kids are still developing. They need to learn and play and have fun.
There is no systemic approach. And that's the worst is with coaches. Because you're going to have, let's say hockey or football, whatever, it doesn't matter. But if you work with young kids, the coach is a lot more, let's say, about himself than the kids. He should be about the kids. But I want to prove that I'm good so that I can coach at the next level, then coach at the next level. So the coach himself has a goal. And the way he thinks or the way the system rewards that is by winning. So you have the win now attitude, which leads to much worse performance. And to the bumper compared that approach, like you're focusing on being the best right now versus investing for the future. And the people who were focusing on winning right now and were more specific to their sport were better until the age of 15. And then after that, they gradually evened out. By 18, it was pretty much even. And then afterwards, it became reversed. Those who were less specialized and more focused on overall holistic development were much better. And that's something that people also failed to understand about the Russian system, is that not only was it a physical education plus sports system, it was an educational system. Correct. They spent time explaining, they had classes about physiology, about biomechanics, about sport, about everything. So that's why many of these guys actually make good coaches. As opposed to the US and Canada, the best players rarely or never make good coaches.
Right. Well, they're just so gifted, and the people in the US system are just highly adaptable and highly survivable. They just were the freaks. That's the only reason they get there. That's like Canada and the Europeans. They don't have the gene pool to pull from that the United States does. There's only so many 7-footers in Canada. So you actually have to develop that 7-footer. You can't just smash them because there's no one to replace them if you break them.
Correct.
So it's, we've gone well over today. We usually do, which I have no surprise over. It's great to chat with you. It's really interesting just how dogmatic our business and industry has become. And it's really refreshing to hear someone like yourself. And like you said, you could be much more profitable, being like the Liver King, telling everyone to just eat organ meats and testicles, and you're going to look like me, which is actually not primal. It's really funny.
I wrote an article about that.
I know you did.
And explain like what actually like Roman soldiers, what they look like. Greek soldier, what they look like. That's not even close.
In a survival situation, I think we'd be okay because we're not like ridiculously super physiological. At least I'm not anymore because I'm not using what I used to use. But guys like that are ridiculously super physiological, those would be the first ones to gas out and die. Absolutely. Like you look at hunter-gatherer tribes, they do not look like the Liver King. No. Like it's too metabolically expensive. And you cannot look like that swollen vascular physique does not come from eating a carnivore diet.
Skin being red is also a dead giveaway.
Yeah, just slightly, but I would rather sleep at night and make a little less money and do what's right than have a fat bank account. That's just me personally, but
as long as my family has enough to have a decent life, then I'm good.
I agree. Well, Christian, tell people where they can find you. I mean, Christian has all sorts of great books, great resources. He's all over the internet. Tell people where they can find you. And I really appreciate you coming on today.
Thank you. It was on Testosterone Nation or tnation.com first. I have over 700 articles there. I also have my own Q&A forum. So anybody who wants to ask me a question can visit there. I have my own page at thibarmy.com. And if you want to find me on social media, just Thibarmy, you're going to find pretty much everywhere. I do have some live Q&As often on my Instagram when I do my cardio. Well, it's not really cardio, it's just me walking on a treadmill, but still it's better than not doing anything.
Yeah, it definitely breaks up the boredom of that. And I love those. I get on those every once in a while and watch. And it's insane the number of questions that people ask that are just like, really? Are you
really? People just want to ask questions.
Yeah.
Like they're just, I want to ask something because I want him to pay attention to me.
Right. Well, there's advantages and disadvantages of the internet because like when we Muscle Media 2000, people like Dan Duchesne, Charles Poliquin, Ian King, all these, I was getting most of my information when I was in high school from, Flex or Iron Man magazine or
Iron Man was pretty good.
Pardon me?
Iron Man was pretty good.
Yeah, from Iron Man, and I read, all of Dan's stuff. I read, Ian King, all those guys like Dan John. There was limited information. You learned a lot from, but I learned in the late 80s as a bodybuilder in Edmonton. There's a gym called Mass Appeal, and the guy was a pro bodybuilder. His brother was a pro bodybuilder as well, and he was a type 1 diabetic. And they told me, like, back then, that managing insulin was the key. Like, insulin was the key. This, and these guys had figured it out decades before everyone else did, right? And so there's that learning through experimentation. You would try things and do things. Now there's so much information out there. It's almost paralysis by analysis, right?
Also, the difference is that, like, back when we wanted to learn something, we actually had to make an effort to learn.
Correct.
Read a book, go to a seminar, talk to an expert, which you had to actually reach out because there was no internet to connect, right? Nowadays, people learn in bits of 30 to 90 seconds. So we have young guys who have a wide amount of knowledge, but that it's like 1 inch deep. They have no understanding.
And no practical application either.
Correct.
There's a huge difference between having head knowledge. I mean, I've been to seminars with people with multiple PhDs that couldn't teach someone how to squat. We couldn't coach them, like, just didn't know how. I'll give one example, then we'll sign off, or one kind of story about the athletic development stuff. I was at an NSCA seminar. I can't remember where, but they had a big roundtable of all these, like, great high school coaches. And there was these 2 high school coaches from the same state. And they basically were like, this is coach such and such. He's won the last 20 high school state championships. And in the same state is this other coach who's got, these accolades. And the high school championship guy is kind of smiling and snickering. And the other guy, the guy who basically didn't had any high school championships, he starts laughing. And then the moderator goes, "Why are you laughing?" He goes, "Ask him how many Olympians he's trained and how many of his kids go to college and swim at the next level." The state championship guy puts his head down. He's like, "None." And the other guy had, like, national champion collegiate swimmers, all these high level college swimmers, multiple Olympians. And he's like, "I don't care about winning now." He's like, "I want to develop these kids so they're the most successful when it actually matters, because who cares about how good you are in high school if I destroy them and burn them out so they don't have the ability to go to the next level? What am I doing as coach?"
Right. Absolutely. That's a good story.
Well, Mr. Thibaudeau, have yourself a wonderful day.
Sure.
And I really appreciate you coming on here. Go check his stuff out. His Q&A on Instagram is great. So follow him and get on there. So have yourself a wonderful day, sir. Thanks everyone for tuning in, and don't forget to get outside.